Hi guys, and welcome to our development part 1 notes. And these notes will be looking at the beginning of life, prenatal development, and the newborn. But we will go over the unit. This is a relatively big unit. It's about 10-12% of your test, and hopefully a little bit should be review, either from your biology classes talking about genetics or your health classes talking about development. But when we're looking at development, we're not just looking at physical development. We're also looking at cognitive or brain changes, and then social interaction. So how we interact with our peers and our parents and people around us throughout our life, as well as how we physically develop and how we mentally develop. Okay, so unit line is looking at developmental psychology. And developmental psychology, just kind of how I outlined, examines how people are continually changing from birth to death. Okay, so looking how we continually change over time. Again, that's physical, cognitive, and social. And you're going to notice these three themes throughout the set of notes, which is there's about 6-7 set of notes. Pretty big unit. So nature versus nurture, we've already talked about, but we'll talk about it again in the context of genetics versus non-genetics. Continuity and stages is relatively new. So we'll be looking at, do we develop in stages like an elevator where we get to a floor or a certain age and all these things happen, and then the next stage all these happens? Or so is it in stages like that, or is it continuous, meaning that we're not necessarily always in one stage like adolescence or preteens or adult, or that we're always kind of going back and forth between the two. So there's continuity in the change. And then stability and change. This is looking at, do we stay the same over our lifespan? Do our characteristics, so whether we have a positive character, outlook on life, or we're a nice person or angry person, does that stay with us from childhood to death? Or do we change? Are people able to change? Okay, throughout this developmental unit, we'll be looking at a couple things. Today we're doing prenatal development and newborn. You'll have notes on infancy and childhood, what your parents and your peers have to do with your development, adolescence, which is your stage right now, adulthood, which is hopefully mine, and then reflection on our developmental issues. Okay, so let's just start with our prenatal development for this notes. So there's a lot of biology terms associated with these notes, so make sure you know them, even if you feel like you have a good idea of what they are. Okay, so conception is the time when sperm meets egg. So women are born with all the eggs or ovums that they'll ever have, even though only about one of those 5,000s mature every month and are released. And then men aren't able to produce sperm until they hit puberty, and they produce millions of sperm. They're constantly producing sperm, versus women are born with the eggs that they'll need. The egg is like 80,000 times bigger than a sperm. So here's a picture on microscopic level. An egg is about the size of like the end of the sentence, like a period, so you can see it. And then sperm are microscopic. So thousands of sperm released, only one gets into the egg. So conception is where the sperm actually goes into the egg, and their cells fuse, right? And what we're really meaning by that is the DNA fuses together. So half of the mom's DNA, half of the dad's DNA come together. And as soon as that happens, it starts a chemical reaction that allows the cell to keep dividing. And by the time that baby is born, it goes from being a single cell at conception to over 100 trillion cells at the time of birth. Okay, a zygote then is that period of time from when it's first fertilized, so conception, to 2 weeks. It's a rapid period of division. Most of the time the woman doesn't even know she's pregnant, and this is where the zygote will turn after that 2 weeks into an embryo. Okay, so the very first stage, at 2 weeks, again, when most women don't even know they're pregnant, it's called the zygote stage. So it's from conception to 2 weeks. So after the zygote stage comes the embryo stage, or the embryonic stage, and this goes from about 2 weeks to 2 months. There's not a lot of information attached to these stages, so I didn't put a lot here, but you need to know the time frame. So we're going from a zygote, fertilized eggs, to embryo to fetus, so Zeph, Z-E-F. So our embryo is 2 weeks to 2 months. The spine starts to develop. So here we're looking at an embryo, and here we're looking at a fetus. By the end of the embryonic stage, the 2 months, you have distinctively human characteristics. And as it starts to go into a fetus, you can definitely tell the human characteristics. So fetus is from 9 weeks to birth. There's a whole bunch of stuff that happens during the fetus stages that we won't talk about in these notes, but we'll look at in class. But we'll look at the relative sizes of the fetus as they move along, and when an embryo turns into a fetus, and when a fetus turns into a newborn, which would be when it's born, looking at where is the like safe stages, when is it going to be okay to sustain life by itself. Okay, so this is a whole bunch of biology terms going into development. Now we're going to talk about what happens in the womb. So this is actually talking about the thing developing physically. Let's look at its environment. So there's a couple things that interact with the baby, all coming from the mother. We'll talk about the genetics at the end of the notes, so the DNA. But let's talk about the environment now. So the prenatal development. So first of all, one of the essential things in development for a fetus, or all the stages, the zygote, embryo, and fetus, is the development of a healthy placenta. So placenta is an organ that is only made by females and only made when they're pregnant. So it actually attaches to the uterine wall, and when a child is born, the placenta is delivered as well. But this is the kind of I want to say like barrier, and also the source of nutrients and oxygen for the unborn child. Okay, so the placenta is an organ just produced by women, and it produces all the nutrients and the oxygen that goes from the mother to the child. Okay, now we'll talk about some things that can go wrong in utero while the baby is developing. So big vocab term you have to know, and it's kind of general in its definition, is teratogens. So teratogen is any type of agent. We're going to mostly negative kind of connotation to it. So teratogen is any agent, chemical or viral, that can reach the embryo or fetus and cause harm. Okay, so it can cross the barrier. So there's some things that can't cross the barrier from from mom to baby. And then the teratogens are able to do that. So we're talking about the bad things that kind of come to mind are any type of drugs. So alcohol, nicotine, cocaine, marijuana, anything that the mother might ingest would go directly to the baby. But these can also be viral infections that can go from mom to baby and cause it harm. So some big teratogens you'll need to know are the nicotine and the things associated with it, like low birth weight, and then fetal alcohol syndrome, or FAS. This is when a mother drinks excessively during pregnancy. It causes the baby to have physical, so they look different. There's some very distinct facial features that come with fetal alcohol syndrome, and also cognitive. So there's generally some type of developmental delay. So their brains look different than the brain of a healthy newborn. It's caused by excessive drinking. In severe cases can include these facial misproportions. And so the eyes tend to be a little bit droopy. There's less facial muscle, control. Has a little bit of like a Downs look. The eyes are spaced a little bit farther apart. They have different shape. These are extreme cases. So most fetal alcohol syndrome children, it's just developmental their capacities, right? So their cognitive abilities. But in some children, the physical features of their faces change as well. And then with nicotine, a teratogen that passes over, that can cause low birth weight and also some developmental delays. And then extreme drugs that people get addicted to, so like heroin and cocaine. Babies' bodies become just as dependent on those drugs as the mom does. The only difference is that after they're born, the baby goes through withdrawals, just like a mother would. The mother is able to keep using if she chooses. Baby can't. So those very horrible withdrawals that we talked about in our consciousness of drugs of abuse, imagine that a newborn going through that. In some cases, it can cause stillbirth, so baby's not to be born alive, or the baby is born with a dependence and then has to go through withdrawal. Okay, so let's talk about, so this is prenatal development. This is all bad, sad stuff. Okay, let's talk about the competent newborn. So newborn, born healthy and developed. So there's a couple different reflexes that babies are born with, or newborn has. And reflexes, I want you to know, are different from instincts. So in our behavioral unit, we talked about an instinct is a primal drive. So, right, it's something that motivates behavior that we don't really have control over. So, an animal's instinct is to kill for food or to run away with loud noises. So, these aren't instincts, these are things that are, or actions that are essential for survival that babies need. So reflexes, you need to know rooting, sucking, swallowing, the Moro reflex, and the Babinski reflex. So I write these down as I explain them. So the rooting reflex, this is when a baby, when you touch their cheek, will turn their head to whatever cheek is touched. So you can think about breastfeeding, right? So when a baby born without good vision, without anything like that, they're born knowing that they need to eat. And when the nipple touches their cheek, it turns towards it. All right, you can do this with like just your finger too, or you can tell when babies are really hungry because they start to like turn into it, whoever they're holding. So the sucking reflex is the second reflex to the rooting, and that's when there's something put in their mouth, whether it's a finger or a nipple or bottle. They suck on it, right? So that's an instinct. No one teaches the baby how to drink milk. And then the swallowing is also a reflex. All right, these things actually happen in utero. So while the baby is still in the womb, you can actually see babies sucking on their fingers. They're practicing basically for when they're born. The Moro reflex is also called the startle reflex. So that's when a baby like hears a loud noise, it kind of drops, it puts its hands up in the air like this. If you've ever seen a baby do that, and it goes like that, and it puts his hands up again. And then the Babinski reflex is on the bottom of the foot. When it's stroked, it kind of spreads its fingers and curls around. So if you go to a baby's foot, their toes will hang on to your finger. Okay, habituation in babies. So how do we know what babies know? And some research has been done on habituation, and this is where researchers give a baby a new stimulus. So and then they watch how fast they habituate to it. And what that means is they stop responding with repeated stimulation. So in the beginning, a baby might be really interested in looking at these shapes, but over time, the same shapes don't bring up the same response. Okay, so repeated exposure equals a loss of interest. So that means it's habituated. We've talked about this with like sensory adaptation. So habitual means like you're getting used to it. We can know that babies prefer novelty or new things than in regards to things that they're used to. And we getting to know a lot more about their sensation and perception. So we know that babies' eyesight changes pretty rapidly. In the beginning, it's about a 6 to 1 foot focused, right? So from just like eye to eye contact, and that gradually increases as a baby develops. And then also with sounds, we know that even in utero, at about 6 months old, the baby can hear different sounds. Okay, so let's wrap it up with talking about nature versus nurture and this developmental stages. So nature is going to be these kind of the bio terms that we talked about review. So anything that's doing with DNA is going to be nature. So genes, chromosomes make up our DNA. Identical versus fraternal twins are going to have the same. So identical have same DNA, the fraternal have different DNA. And then genetic disorders that you need to know about that I'm kind of hoping you remember from your bio class. PKU and Tay-Sachs are both an enzyme deficient a genetic disorder, so they don't code for, with Tay-Sachs, the enzyme that breaks down fat, or with PKU, an enzyme that breaks down proteins, and these are both fatal disorders. PKU you can live with it. Tay-Sachs is about 5 years old, is the oldest Tay-Sachs patients live. And then Down syndrome is caused by an extra chromosome. So the 21st chromosome here, there's an extra one. So there's actually 47 chromosomes instead of 46. So these are all nature problems with an infant. Versus our nurture, so looking at genetic interactions in the womb. FAST, so fetal alcohol syndrome, and nicotine dependence. Anything that happens in the womb as far as the baby's exposed to the teratogens that the mother might have, the food that she eats, anything like that. And then, of course, the parents. If babies are able to tell what's going on in the environment, if there's loud noises, if there's abuse, or if it's quiet and nurturing, we would have different interactions. Okay, so these are our notes finishing on nature versus nurture, looking back on our last developmental stages. And our next notes, we'll look at infancy and childhood. So after a baby is born, newborn to where they're toddler to becoming a child. Have a good night.